Okay, hello everyone. I'm Sofia Freudenstein. I am ASBI's Maharat intern for this year, and welcome to Parsha class. Parsha class is where we look at different passages from our Parsha, see how the Talmud interfaces with them, and then think about how we can approach our Parsha in a different way with that new insight. We have been going strong, doing this now for 20 different sessions, so I think the theory works that we can combine these things together, which is really fun. And we're going to do some more of that today. And what's really awesome about the Gemara that we're going to learn today is that it's connected to Purim. So that's really thematic for next week. I'm going to put the link to the source sheet in the chat. I will also share my screen and let's get started. Okay, I think, yes, everything. Oh, there we go. I think it's working. Can people see? We're good. Okay. Amazing. So last week, we started off these parshiot all about things in the temple. We started off with a lot of discussion of different objects, ritual objects that appeared in the temple when we were looking at that. Now we're going to be focusing on the garments or clothing that the Kohanim, the priests, were wearing. And I'm hoping that by looking at this today, that maybe we'll find some meaning in it that we might not have now, because this is a practice that feels kind of foreign to us right now. We do not have temple. This is not how we connect with God, but maybe there's still something for us to appreciate here. So I'm going to start us off with the Torah sources that we have here. There won't be so much necessarily to discuss, but what will be interesting is to see then how the Gemara takes them in a whole new light. So I will start us off with the Hebrew and then I will translate. Okay. Ve'ata hakrev elecha et Aharon achicha ve'et banav ito mitoch b'nei Yisrael lechahanu li Aharon Nadav Avihu Elazar v'itamar b'nei Aharon. So we have a little bit of an introduction of who exactly the Kohanim are. So it says that you, B'nai Israel, will bring forward Aharon. Well, this is also to Moshe in particular. So you're going to bring Aharon, your brother, and his children with him from B'nai Israel to be priests for me. This is Aharon, his children Nadav and Avihu, Elazar and Itamar, the children of Aharon. Later on in the Torah, Nadav and Avihu will make another appearance where they get in a little bit of trouble. But for now, there's just 4 sons and they're all doing God's work. Okay, next verse. Vasita vigdei kodesh la'Aharon achicha lechavod u'letifaret. And you will make special clothes, holy clothes, for Aharon, your brother, for dignity and adornment. That's a nice translation from Sefaria. Yeah, for respect, for splendor, I would say. Okay. ואתה תדבר על כל חכמי לב אשר מלאתיו רוח חוכמה ועשו את בגדי אהרון לקדשו לכהנו לי. And you will speak to all those who have wisdom of the heart, who have this this sense of like wisdom. It's interesting, the term here is ruach chokhmah, because that means wind technically. So it's the idea that they're endowed with this gift of intellect, and they will create these clothes for Aharon in order to sanctify him and then make him a priest, which is a really interesting way to talk about what does it mean to be creative, to create clothing, that like you need to have this level of divine inspiration. Okay, next verse. ואלה הבגדים אשר יעשו חושן ואפוד ומעיל וכתונת תשבץ מצנפת ואבנית ועשו בגדי קודש לאהרון אחיך ולבניו לכהנו לי. Okay, and these are the clothes. We're going to have a little bit of a list of what they made. Okay, and they're like some more technical things. You're gonna have a breast piece, an ephod, which was it's part of the breast piece, and also a robe, fringed tunic, a headdress, and a sash. Okay, and you're gonna make all those for Aharon. You're gonna take gold, blue, purple, crimson yarns and all the fine linen. And you're going to create an ephod of gold, of blue, purple, and crimson, and of twisted or sewn together linen works into design. Okay, that's a lot of design terms to talk about what the Kohanim are going to wear. It's just pretty fancy. I have a diagram for us that I found online if you just want to have some kind of visualization of what's going on. Lots of colors. There's the breast piece. Also, they have the headpiece, and also it says God's name on the top. There's also these amazing bells on the bottom that it's hard to see the picture, but they're shape of pomegranates. And so that's how you could tell whenever the Kohen was walking by, which was pretty cool. I also have here, Molly couldn't necessarily make it tonight, but for those of you who know Molly from ASBI, she did dress up as a Kohen Gadol last year, and I did get the photo, and I thought that was very important for all of us to see because all the kids at CGDS really enjoyed it. So if you want a visual of what it looked like in real life, there you go. Okay. So that's the Kohen and what the Kohanim are supposed to wear. It's a little fantastical. It feels, I don't want to say pagan, that feels a little extreme, but definitely not what I imagine people are wearing when they go to shul. And yet this is how the temple service was conducted. And I read this and I think that's cool and interesting, but I, as a woman, as a Bat Levi, like this just isn't relevant to my life so much. So I don't find it particularly meaningful. And what I'm hoping to show is how the Gemara is going to problematize it in a way that all of a sudden it's going to become meaningful. So that's where I want to take us next. Unless anyone has any specific questions, I'd recommend that we move on straight to the Gemara where things start getting interesting. So I think I'm just going to do that, if that's okay. Before we get to the Talmud sources, this is where the Purim stuff starts coming in. I think an integral background context is the book of Esther for what we're about to read. So what I would be curious for you to do, if you are so willing, is to listen to the story of Esther and think about what parallels maybe did we see in the story that we just read, which might seem like a far-fetched, but we're going to try. So this is from the beginning of Esther, where we start off with the party at Achashverosh's house. This is when Queen Vashti eventually gets kicked out, and then Achashverosh is going to need a new queen, and that's how Esther shows up. So, but first is just this fantastical description of what the party was. So it says, "Vayhi b'yimei Achashverosh, hu Achashverosh hamalech mehodu ve'ad Kush, sheva esrim u'mei ha'medina." So in the time of Achashverosh, who Achashverosh, the king from India until Ethiopia, he was the king of 127 provinces. So in those days, when Achashverosh was sitting and being king on his throne, this was in Shushan, Susa, which was the capital. בשנת 3 למלכו עשה משתה לכל שריו ועבדיו, חיל פרס ומדי הפרטמים ושרי המדינות לפניו. In the 3rd year of his reign, he hosted a big party, a banquet, for all the officials and courtiers, everyone in charge of Persia and Media, the nobles and the governors of the province in his service. V'haroto et osher kivod malchuto ve'et yakar tiferet gedulato, yamim rabim shmonim u'me'at yom. When at the end of, there were 180 days that in which he was doing this party, where he showed all the amazing riches of his kingdom and all the splendor and glory of the kingdom. That stuff is highlighted because that's what we're going to talk about. Uvim lo'ot hayamim ha'ele asa ha'melech l'chol ha'am hanimtzeim b'shushan habira lemigadol ve'ad katan mishteh shivat yamim b'chatzar ginat vitan ha'melech. At the end of those days, the king and all of the people, the nation that were found in Shushan, the capital city, from big to small, they had an additional 7-day party in the courtyard of the king. Very extravagant. And we have 2 more verses of description. Chur karpasu techelet, achuz v'chavlevut v'argaman, al gililei chesef v'amudei sheish, mitot zahav v'chesef, al ritzpat v'hat v'sheish v'dar v'socharet. There were hangings, like amazing decorations, of white cotton, blue wool, caught up in cords of fine linen and purple wool, to silver rods and alabaster columns, couches of gold and silver, and pavement of marble, alabaster, mother of pearl mosaics. And the last line, "V'ashkod b'chlei zahav, v'chelim mekelim shonim, v'yein malchut rav kidat hamelech." And they had lots of great things they were drinking out of, and lots of varied vessels, and lots of wine for the king. Okay, so that was pretty extravagant. Seems like a lot of description for something that we might not necessarily need description for. But what the Gemara is going to show is a connection between what we just read and our Parsha, and see that there's actually some significance to all of these lavish details. And that's what we're going to go to now. So this is the Gemara from Masechet Megillah. We have seen, I'm trying to know if we've seen Masechet Megillah before. I don't think so. We've seen other tractates in which they're like names of holidays, And so this is one of them. So it's actually interesting, like which holidays get their own tractate, and which ones sound like the name of the holiday and which not. Like Pesach has Pesachim, which makes sense, or Sukkot has Sukkah. But for Purim, we have Megillah, which is a lot about the rules about how you're supposed to read the Megillah of Megillat Esther. And what's really fun about this Masachet is that in the middle, there are lots of different stories and almost kinds of midrashim interpretations of the Esther story, just interspersed throughout the law, which is really fun. And so that's what we have here, where they literally go through verse by verse of the first chapter of Esther and give these amazing descriptions. Like, if you've ever heard that Esther was green, that is a very strange midrash, and it appears in this section. If you've ever heard Vashti had a tail, that also is in this section, which would be a fun sheer in and of itself. But now, how are we going to talk about our verses? So this is from verse 4 of Esther. Baharoto et osher kavod malchuto. This is describing what Achashverosh was wearing. He was wearing riches of glorious, from his kingdom, glorious things and majestic clothes. Okay. Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina said, this teaches that Achashverosh wore the priestly vestments. Proof of this assertion may be adduced from the fact that the same terms are written with regard to the priestly vestments as is written here, the riches of his glorious kavod kingdom and the honor of his majestic tiferet greatness, and is written there with regard to the priestly garments for the glory, kavod, and for majesty, tiferet. Okay, so what's happening? They're taking a verse that we saw from Esther about what Achashverosh was wearing, and they notice that the words are exactly the same as what we read in our Parsha. So the similarity in terms here are tiferet, that's the one that was the splendor, glory term. And it's unusual to see it in the context of clothing. So it seems to be an indication that there must be some kind of connection between the two. And so not only is there a connection between the two, but the idea is that Achashverosh himself is wearing the priestly garments. He took the Kohen Gadol's clothing and was wearing it at his party. So the question I want to, I guess, start us off with before we see more about what it could mean is, how does that make you feel? The idea that Achashverosh, who's a pretty silly king, he doesn't really have so much, he's the king of 127 provinces, but he doesn't really have so much control throughout the Esther story. Haman is really in charge, and he's the one kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes. And Achashverosh is very silly. He's drunk all the time. He is not able to like get the hints that Haman or Esther are dropping. And he isn't even able to like catch on to his own assassination plot. And he is the one who's now wearing the clothes of the Kohen Gadol. How does that sit with you? Barry, start us off.
I'm honored. I think Achashverosh is like putty. He's persuaded by everybody up front, and whoever's got his ear gets his attention and gets his favor. And then if somebody else comes along who says something different but still makes sense to Achashverosh at that point, then he switches to that. And it's more general in the story. He goes from Vashti, who people are telling him, show off your stuff. 30 year of your reign, show off your glory, your flex your muscle, show your greatness and all this kavod and tiferet. So he does. And I think that's why he's wearing Kohen Gadol stuff. He's got no business wearing Kohen Gadol stuff any more than our kings do. But he does. So he's been persuaded to do this, in my opinion. And when he orders Vashti, for example, to party with him, show off her beauty, she's insulted somehow. She rebels, and his 7-person group get his attention and tell him how bad this is, and how every husband in the kingdom is going to look bad to his wife, and when the husband wants something of his own whim. And so Achashverosh shows some flexes some muscle. He's just persuaded all the time. This is absolutely contrary to our people, who are Moshe, who is king and priest until the installation of Aaron and our own sons. And when everybody gets their role set, that's where they are, and it's respectful amongst each other. The wild card being Korach. So we are. Our hierarchy is respectful of each other in our positions. And Achashverosh, he seems to be flying alone, getting influenced all the way along. I'm amazed that he's wearing this clothes, but I think he doesn't belong in them at all. He's the last guy who belongs in this stuff, aside from Haman. He's really the last guy who belongs.
Yeah, thank you. From what I'm gathering from what you said, I wonder the intention behind Achashverosh, but you're saying like there's no point in questioning his intention altogether. Like there's no way he is like conscientiously doing this. Like he's already someone who isn't really so grounded in reality, or also is just like taking what other people say to him as what he should be doing. So not that we shouldn't necessarily read anything to it, but like it's off that he's doing this, but you know, maybe there's no malintent in what's going on based off of how he is as a person. Is that right?
And he's persuaded by people to do what he does.
Totally. Does anyone else want to share before we go on? Cool. Okay. If you want to share as we go along, feel free to join in.
Please.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what is interesting for me that we'll talk about is the reaction that I have when seeing this. Like I just was telling you how I don't care about the Big Day Kahuna. Like I don't care how people dress. Like, and then all of a sudden this feels wrong. So I want to explore why that exactly feels wrong. And that's where I want to go with it. Something that I want to point out is like providing some historical context for why exactly he would even have the clothes, and some interesting other details to point out in the Esther story to like really heighten the potential problematizing of the situation. So the time period of Esther is when this is already after the destruction of the first temple, which was in 586 BCE. The Jews are in exile at Babylon. They return 70 years later under King Cyrus. And after that is the Esther story. So the Esther story is about the Jews that stayed and didn't go back to Israel, which is already interesting in and of itself. There's a lot of interesting things you could think about with Esther and Mordechai's names, for example. They're very assimilated names. Marduk is the name of a god that is from the Persian Empire. And Mordechai is Marduk Chai. Marduk lives, which is really interesting, right? Like he's the hero of our Purim story, and he has a very assimilated name, which is, I think, it's always like a fun thing for me when thinking about Purim and like who we're talking about, like how much we're supposed to be identifying with these people or not. But the people here are very, you could say, assimilated, the Jews they're going to be talking about, and they had the option to return post-exile, and they did not. So I think that's like one interesting layer. But then you think, okay, so then how did he have access to the clothes? Like this was left over from exile when Nebuchadnezzar from the Babylonian time period took all the things out of the temple and paraded them out. Like this was what was left over in the basement of the palace. And he just pulls it out like a costume, which feels very painful. Like these were very holy garments, and then all of a sudden they're being worn at a party. And two other examples of this that actually appear in the text, and I also highlighted them, is when we saw before the decorations, the hangings of white cotton and blue wool caught up by cords of fine linen and purple wool. We also just saw this in our Parsha, that those colors are the description of what the Kohen was wearing, like those clothing. These clothing represent what was in the temple, and they're just being used as like party decorations, which feels hard. And then the one that maybe is I would say more familiar because there's a change in how we read the text on Purim is the one in verse 7, Kelim shonim, beakers of varied design. We read in echatrope as opposed to megillotrope. So we read it the same way we would read the Book of Lamentations on Tisha B'Av, which is much more mournful and lamentful. And that's when we commemorate the destruction of the temple. And understood, built into that is when with the shift in the tune, is that actually those are not just beakers, they are actually the the vessels from the Beit HaMikdash. They're drinking out of goblets and parts of the sacrificial process, and they're just drinking out of them like cups at a party. And it's supposed to feel very painful to see that that's what they're being used for now. So it's not just this Gemara, but it's even built into the way that we read and talk about the Megillah in a way that I think is quite jarring. And I think it's supposed to be jarring.
Sophia?
Yeah, go for it.
You really opened my eyes to something that I just probably slept through up until now. And that is, it never occurred to me that these were the clothes of our Kohanim and our priests. And the Kohen Gadol and the sons of the priest. I just thought this was like copying, adapting, like what we had that was beautiful. Our masters, basically, where we were living, adapted similar things. It never occurred to me, and I never saw any language that said that this was clothing of our Kohanim. That really makes it a lot more intense.
Yeah.
That should be the case. And yet those are the things. And now I'm back to on Yom Kippur, when the story of the Kohen Gadol is told, and how he's administering the service, and he changes clothes 5 times and washes the clothes and takes another set. And when he's inside, he's dressed in the white and modestly adorned vestments. And when he's outside, he's in the golden vestments. And there's Rashi commentary that says that the Kohen has to change his clothes back and forth so that he's humble before God and he is adorned before the people, but before God, the prosecutor can't be dressed like a prosecutor back from the golden calf time, when Aaron played a role in the creation of the golden calf. We're told that there was some good intent on his part to hold back the push of the assembled multitude, wanting to create the golden calf and whatnot. Aaron tried to stall the time, buy Moshe time to get back down from the mountain. So he tried to keep it alive. So he played the most modest role he could, and yet hold them back. So, so he's not permitted to wear that golden stuff inside the Holy of Holies when he's doing his service inside there. He wears them outside, and that's what he does, these 5 changes according to Rashi. And it's really beautiful. It's really a stunning story that Aaron is wearing 2 hats. He's our advocate and he's our confessor. and he's part of the confession. So it's really a neat story. So I see that kind of thing here, where we get these different kinds of vestments that are going on. I don't know. It's like kind of wild card.
I think that's a great point. So for those of you who might not know what Barry's referencing, within Yom Kippur, we have in the Musaf service a description of what the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, is doing in order to atone for us, because that was the big day for the high priest. And the description is somewhat morbid, but also quite beautiful, right? Like there's like the discussion of like what he's doing sacrificially, but then also the way that he's like bowing, prostrating for us, like in front of God. And there is a lot of costume changes, and that shows that there really is significance in what they're wearing at certain times. And also something that Barry referenced is that at some point he takes off the gold that he usually wears, that we see here, because we don't want to remind God of the golden calf on the day that we're trying to repent for our sins. I would recommend, if anyone is curious about like how to find that accessible, is a few years ago, Yishai Ribo, who is a religious Zionist Israeli music artist, he made an amazing song called Seder HaAvodah, where he puts to music the description of what's happening with the Kohen during that time. and it's 7 minutes long, and it's really amazing. I think there were like quite a few articles in English that came out afterward to explain what was going on, because it made it feel alive in a way that was really impressive for those of us thousands of years later reading about the experience. So I'm happy to send a link at some point, or you're welcome to follow up with me by email. I'm happy to send it to you.
Please.
So yes, costume changes were huge. So I see my sister messaged me about thanking me for mentioning Yishai Gribo. Thank you. Okay. So yes, so there's lots there about the significance of clothes. And I think you're right. Like this is why I think the historical context is necessary, is that this wasn't just, Achashverosh saw that the Kohanim looked really cool and wanted to copy them, but like he really was taking the leftover garments from exile and putting them on, and that feels different. So yeah, I think that's totally there.
Shocking.
So let's figure out why that feels wrong. That's what we're going to go through now. And the answer is clothing and identity are very connected. So this is funny because I don't often see myself as living up to that. I often am not thinking so carefully about what I'm wearing, and I mostly wear things for comfort, but clothing and identity are often very intertwined. And so what I want to do is show how the rabbinic commentators show how the significance of the Kohen's clothes says something about identity. And then we're going to explore philosophically why clothing being worn by other people feels wrong to us. Like what exactly is going on there? How do we articulate the difficulty of that experience? So the first source I want to look at is from the Ramban, from Nachmanides. And this is a commentary on what we read, L'chavodu L'tifaret. I'll read in English for the sake of time. He says, for honor and for splendor, that he should be honored and glorious with honorable and glorious clothing. As the verse states in Isaiah, as a groom and ministers in glory, all of these clothes were the clothes of royalty. Their likeness is worn by kings during the time of the Torah. So kind of similar to what Barry mentioned, like these are beautiful clothes. Kings wore them. We think that service in the temple is something that is a holy experience, but also one that is one you should look good for. You're presenting yourself in front of God. You're showing how important you are. And so it makes sense that you would wear kind of these fancy clothes for this experience. So that's helpful, like to understand, okay, maybe Achashverosh was like in that mode. But the Ibn Ezra says something a little different. Ibn Ezra is also a medieval commentator. He's often also more pshat oriented, as in he's often not looking for midrashic understandings of the text, but something literal. And so he says, Vasita Vikte Kodesh, and thou shalt meet holy garments. They are called holy garments because they are worn during the sanctuary service. On the one hand, it is possible that they were called holy garments in accordance with that they sanctify not the people with their garments. The garments of Aaron referred to in our verse are the ones of scripture later enumerates. Okay, basically what he's saying is this is what Kohanim wear. If you saw someone wearing this, you go, oh, that's a Kohen, I know who you are. So he's stressing to us that, okay, like it's true that kings wore it, but like this, if you saw that someone was wearing this, you're going to think Kohen. You're not necessarily going to be thinking king. So this is stressing to us that there is a real correlation between these kinds of clothing and also what the Kohanim were wearing. And so it's important that this is like tying the identity together. Now I'll bring a very eloquent quote from yet another significant source, which is Vogue magazine, describing the significance of clothing. And this is actually, it's written by Maureen Sayre, who is a fashion designer. Don't know much about her, but she's obviously very impressive. She's in Vogue. What does she say? This was in the context of an article about the influence of politics on fashion. This is interesting time. This was in September 2020. So lots of politics had happened up until that point. She says, every choice you make, also in COVID, every choice you make as a company will influence the world. What you make, how you make it, how you speak to what you've made. For me, everything is politics. So what she's saying is that the clothing, she's never just making something totally neutral. It obviously has to be influence some point about the world that she's living in. I don't fully know what that means, like in the sense of like, if you're just making a t-shirt, I don't know if there's like so much politics involved there, but I don't know, I guess like if there was like a color that was very significant politically that year, if you're thinking about modesty, probably there's some politics there. We might have better clothing experts in the audience who might have more concrete examples of how this might play out. But it seems clear to her that her art in creating is connected to the world that she is living in, and I think that that's that's very powerful. And to use clothing as the medium for that, I think is interesting. So when we take that into account, when thinking about Achashverosh and thinking about what clothing we decide to put on, as much as I joke that I don't really think about what I put on, like often clothing is signaling something. And so then one wonders, like, what exactly is Achashverosh attempting to signal? He could be someone who was a little bit of a buffoon and like wasn't really aware of what he was doing. Or is there also some kind of assertion of power of saying, haha, you were all in exile, I'm in charge now, and I'm wearing your priest's clothes? And I think that that's an interesting read that's a little bit more subversive, insidious, maybe giving Achashverosh a little more power than he really had. But it's jarring when you read the text, and I wonder if that's where it's coming from. Barry, did you want to say something?
I wanted to, as long as you brought up Vogue magazine and
Oh, please share.
there was a movie called The Devil Wears Prada, I think it was. Was that the name
Yes,
of the
I'm
movie?
familiar.
If you've seen that movie, Meryl Streep's character is in a room with her certain subordinate colleagues and maybe outside colleagues too, but and then comes Anne Hathaway's character, and then she's dressed like herself, and she hasn't been enlightened yet. And Meryl Streep gives a lecture, pointed, very erudite, very systematic, and lays out the influence that's thrust on people by the designers, by the magazine editors, by these decision makers, and how they influence things and how that goes on to influence just about everything for years to come. And it's very powerful. And Maureen Sarahs is making a point here that just opens me up to The Devil Wears Prada. It's ages old. It's been around forever, and it works. It really works. So Achashverosh is a victim, but he employed it, and God dictates it to Moshe and our Kohanim, and there's a basis.
I never thought The Devil Wears Prada would ever appear in a shiur before, and I'm so happy that I'm wrong.
Well, you started it with Vogue.
Yeah, I asked for it.
Just joking.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything they want to share that they feel in reaction to this so far? Maybe they don't relate to clothes this way. Maybe they do. Well, I'm going to move on to the next source, but if you feel like you want to share, you're always welcome to jump in.
Thanks.
So now I'm going to put on the philosophy hat and think, well, it's not just good enough to say I have a visceral reaction, but I need to explain why I have a visceral reaction to this experience. So this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This was a real lifesaver of mine throughout college whenever I was writing a philosophy paper. Really amazing entries about different levels of different realms of philosophical thought. And what's interesting is they have a whole section about cultural appropriation. And I do feel like this is a kind of cultural appropriation. But we're going to discuss what that means philosophically, as opposed to thinking about like maybe what it means in the current like political climate that we have. People might hear that term and kind of get a little defensive. I think that it's interesting to see how it's explored philosophically, and then we'll figure out how we can apply it here. So in section 4.1, what is cultural appropriation? Cultural appropriation is generally understood as the taking or use of the cultural products of cultural insiders by cultural outsiders. Cultural products can range widely, including stories, styles, motifs, artifacts, artworks, traditional knowledge, as well as representations of the member of a particular culture. Questions about cultural appropriation thus often arise in a broad array of artistic contexts, in particular but not limited to music and fashion, as well as other non-artistic contexts, such as costumes, hairstyles, cuisine, and traditional knowledge. Okay, so basically what part one is doing is defining for us what a cultural appropriation is. This idea of there's cultural insiders and outsiders. So when cultural outsiders take something from the inside of a culture and use it for their own purposes and potentially for different purposes than they were intended for. What is now part two? And then we'll tie it back to us. Harm, 2.2. What might be wrong with cultural appropriation? So what may make cultural appropriation harmful? For one, it might be thought of as a wrongfully exploitive, defined, for instance, as the appropriation of elements of a subordinated culture by a dominant culture without substantive reciprocity, permission, and/or compensation. So basically what we're clarifying here is that, okay, like we love gleaning from other cultures. Like hopefully we are people of the world and we are not living in our own bubbles. That's not the problem. It's more so thinking about the context in which to do it, the level of consent between two people, and when thinking about that, and is it being used for authentic good purposes, or is it used kind of a way to like make fun? This obviously I think is like much more like I wouldn't necessarily say subjective, but it's really dependent on each situation, I think, and this is why it gets very messy. But what I think is helpful here in this articulation is about, for me, I think it provides a reason for why I feel a sense of discomfort thinking about the idea of Achashverosh wearing the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, because it's a kind of appropriating of my culture for something that is fun and merry for him. Something that the Kohen Gadol was wearing when the Kohen Gadol was advocating for us on the holiest day of the Jewish year and helping make sure that all of us are able to move on to the next year, is now being used at a party where everyone is drunk and messing around. And like that feels painful. Not only that, we have this layer of Achashverosh is in charge, we are in exile, we are not at the same level of power, and then these holy garments are being used to make fun of. And I think that for me, this like helps explain what the pain is. One wonders, like we were saying, like how aware was Achashverosh in what he was doing? Like, I don't know if he was sitting there being like, haha, like, let me think how to pain the Jews. I don't think so. But nonetheless, like it's important to be sensitive and to think about when I glean something from another person or another group of people, like what exactly am I doing it for and for what purpose? And I think that this philosophical articulation kind of explains like what exactly is going on there. And when we say that the clothing of the Kohen Gadol is associated with holy experiences, with sacrament, and then it's being used at this party, like that feels off for a reason. So the last verse I want to leave us off with that we can open up to discussion is a little bit about like, well, okay, I felt the sense of feeling a sense of frustration, discombobulation by seeing that midrash, but why is that a big deal? As in, I felt that way, but can it actually teach me something? And I think the answer is yes. And I think it'll be an interesting silver lining to our Parsha. So this source is yet another philosophy source. This is from Martin Heidegger. Heidegger is a 20th century philosopher and Nazi, which I guess is an important caveat for people who don't know, but he had great philosophy. But it's good to take some of it with a grain of salt when he starts talking about, you know, people who are superior as opposed to other ones. He does do a lot of description though about what human experience is like of the world. And he explains things in really interesting ways. And this is one of the ways he talks about them. And hopefully this will tie everything up together. So he writes in his magnum opus, Being in Time, unhandy things are disturbing and make evident the obstinacy of what is initially to be taken care of before anything else. With this obstinacy, the presence of what is at hand makes itself known in a new way as the being of what is still present and calls for completion. That was a lot of jargon. What Heidegger is saying, think about, let's say, a door when you have a room. Whenever you leave or enter the room, you're not thinking about the door. You're just going in and out of the room. All of a sudden, one of the hinges gets rusty and you're like, whoa, there's a door here. Like I had no idea. Often when things are broken, do you realize that they're present? And that's what he's saying about the world, that most of the time we go through life not really noticing what is happening around us until there's something off. And then we realize how important that thing was. Which I think is a really interesting way to think about like what is the human experience. And I don't know, it's a little bit sad. Like, why can't we also like realize and recognize things when they're good? But I think that seeing when something isn't functioning well tells us something deeply about what the function actually is. And for me, that's how I feel about reading this source of Masechet Megillah. I talked about how I don't really feel any kind of connection to the clothing of the Kohen as a 21st century Jew. And then all of a sudden I see it being done wrong. This is not the right way to do it. This Achashverosh is wearing it at a party. It should not be at a party. It should be at the gravitas of Yom Kippur and the sacrificial experience, and it's not happening there. That feels wrong. And then all of a sudden I've shown, wait a minute, I do care. I actually do have an orientation towards these clothing. And even though it's not a part of my daily experience now, like it's something that bothers me, which shows that I care. And for me, that's what I kind of feel this source from Masechet Megillah is trying to do, is it's showing us that something was off, but I think that it's kind of the silver lining to it is that all of a sudden something that didn't feel important to me all now does. And for me, that I've found that very redeeming when reading this. Like now, I'm like, oh, I'm excited for Parsha Tetzaveh, so fun. I'm not sure I'll feel that way in Shul the Shabbat, but I think that it provides a whole new level of appreciation for these parshiot when they often feel so spiritually distant, and it makes me realize, well, even if I don't feel so spiritually close to them now, that there's obviously something there because I don't like when it's not done well. And hopefully I can take that instead from being the negative to seeing it in the positive. And feeling, if we're thinking about cultural appropriation, like all of a sudden I'm saying the big day kiguna, the priestly garments are part of my culture. Like that's a really nice idea, actually, that this is like part of how I imagine my Jewish heritage. So I hope from seeing some of these sources, we can maybe be taking some new ideas for our Parsha. But before we really wrap up, does anyone want to share any thoughts, reactions, frustrations with what we saw?
I'll wait my turn, but I have something.
Does anyone want to go before Barry?
Please, go right ahead, please. I know you guys are thinking it. Go ahead.
Start us off, Barry, and we'll see if anyone wants to jump in.
I have a different spin for you, but before I forget, I want to ask you the mundane questions. Young appears at least 3 times in the section before, and then Brunk and Rogers appear once each. Who are these guys?
Oh, these are different philosophers. These are different people, like contemporary philosophers.
Is that the same
Young?
That's
No, like Carl Jung is spelled Jung, if that's what you were thinking.
I'm looking at these names, Young. It's the same name 3 times. And,
oh yeah, it's up paper. I could send you the link. Well, the link actually is here. It's like they're all. There's a whole bibliography. I'm sure they'd appreciate someone looking through that bibliography.
Okay,
so
I'm good with that. But my thought is, I have a different spin than what I'm hearing tonight, and it's with respect. Please. And I'm thinking that Achashverosh is Gumby. He's putty, and he's clay, and he's getting influenced. If I sound like repetition from the beginning, I haven't changed my mind. So somebody got his ear, and he is now in the 3rd year of his reign. And all of a sudden, he realizes, whether it's from out or from his own mind or both, that he's got an exiled people here. He's got a subjugation going on. And he is seeing us and our civilization, if you will, our people at simultaneously our best and our worst. We've been kicked out. Our temple's been destroyed. We're licking dust. We're away from home. We've been deprived of our love. We've been deprived of, and it's our fault. We did something or things that have just, God just ran out of patience. God is extremely patient, I promise you. So here we are. So we're down. We're down about ourselves, but we gotta pick ourselves up. How are we gonna get back to the promised land? How are we gonna get back to Canaan? So, in the garden. So we're starting to be at our best, and we've got this influence from Mordechai. The name you described is beautiful. I think he has at least one other name too, by the way. And then of course there's Esther, who's also Hadassah, and we've got some good influence with us, good influence people with us. But we're down, and we're proud at the same time to all make it work, to show our humility and show our our worthiness. So Achashverosh is suddenly aware that he's got these people under him, and he decides, and here's my different spin. If he starts to wear our Kohanim vestments, he may be thinking that he's showing himself a relation to us, that he's trying to say, look, your admired priests wore this stuff. I want you to admire me, and I want to be admired, and I want your respect. So if it was good for them, then it's probably good for me. And I think as perverted as he was, that's where I think he was going with all this. And
Yeah,
so I don't
that's
think
helpful.
we should be insulted that the impure people are using our holy garments. But I don't know that it's not to ridicule them. I think it's to try to relate to us. And he doesn't know how to relate to us spiritually and philosophically. So he relates to us by the outer garments. And here we are, Devil Wears Prada and Vogue. And that's where he's going with this, I think. Okay.
Yeah, I think my response to that would be it's a charitable read of Achashverosh, that he didn't mean any harm, that he was trying to show that he was connected to the people.
I'm not going to go far, by the way.
Okay, maybe I'm
he
reading
could have been
too.
hard, but
Yeah,
I
too
think he
mercifully
meant to get respect and to
from
relate
them.
to us too. Yeah, I don't think it was purely harm. Is what I'm trying to say.
But then what I'd want to differentiate between is this idea of intent versus impact, meaning that people's intentions can be good, but that doesn't necessarily mean the impact is good. And that's like a really
no,
great
totally.
like ethical philosophical question that I think it comes up a lot nowadays about, like, even if someone means well, if it wasn't received well, like how much does one have to take responsibility for that or not?
Absolutely.
And so I think we can think of, I mean, I think this comes up often with like Jews and anti-Semitism now, where we think about people who are like trying to help and actually like it's like kind of like it's actually worse sometimes, saying, oh well, all my best friends are Jews, like that's an attempt at trying to like feel connected. It's like, actually that feels very off that you said that.
Sure.
And I think that like that's a little example, but I think that we can think often, doesn't even necessarily have to be marginalized groups, but when thinking about like how do we show that we are like trying to connect, be allies, like what does that look like, and then how do we make sure that that's like actually the help that people want to be getting. And it's, I think what would be better, and I can't tell Achashverosh what to do and how to have a better political campaign, but it would probably be to like actually meet with the Jewish people and ask them what they're looking for in a leader and how to feel connected. And I think that often can bridge that intent versus impact gap, is just communicating with each other, and seeing what help can look like. So maybe that was a soapbox as opposed to an answer, Barry, but
it was good. It was good. You're a product of political correctness. And
yeah, I guess it says something about my generation, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm with you.
That even if he meant well to try and bridge these relations, that I mean it was done pretty out of touch here, and that still matters.
I'll make one quick anecdote about my own experience with my own minion. There was a time pre-COVID when I showed up every day, twice a day, weekdays, and then of course Shabbat, like as with joy. But I showed up weekdays, morning and evening, and Rabbi Wilkenfeld can tell you about that sometime. And I once walked in to a group of men, and I walked in and greeted them, hello, boys. And a senior rabbi with smicha, but not our public rabbi, but one of the minyan, but a former chairman of the board, a long time tzaddik and wise person amongst the congregation. Mel Shapiro, I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he's been gone since early COVID, but he was there. I walked in and I greeted the minyan as boys, and Rev Shapiro turned to me from his seat and he said, "We're not boys." I said, "Okay, excuse me. Good evening, gentlemen." So I myself felt the sting of my own, what I didn't imagine would be interpreted as a lack of respect, because my dad would come home and my brothers and I, and he would say, "Hello, girls. Hello, boys." And then so I felt the sting myself. We are a time of political correctness within ourselves and from outside and from inside. And so it's we're learning about each other and how to be respectful, but it wasn't always that case. And this is a mixed time. This is a confusing time for us as well as for Achashverosh. We're all
Something's never
confused
changed
at
that
this
way.
point, except we are sure that we want to get back home. So we're a little bit, when Haman comes along, we're thinking, we may go down. We've been kicked out of our land, and there are times when we may go down, but you aren't going to eliminate us. That's not going to happen on our watch. And we prevailed this time.
Thank you.
Okay.
Does anyone else
Oh, I
want
was
to
on a
share?
soapbox. I'm sorry.
No. Soapboxes are very real. Does anyone else want to share before we wrap up? Kayla, nice to see you. Would you like to share?
Okay.
Wait 1 second. Let me just lower my hand and
Hi.
turn
Oh
my
my
camera.
gosh, hi.
Hello. I wanted to share a little bit more on your soapbox. So I'm
Please.
sorry for going
Please
back.
do.
Go for it.
But I think if you touched on your philosophy hat, so I'm going to put on my historian hat a little bit. And I think this is an interesting topic when talking about anything relating to like Jewish history, because from a historical perspective, it becomes really problematic when we start looking at things in the past with like all the knowledge that we have today, right? So in the era of political correctness or even cultural appropriation, these conversations don't necessarily hold any form of relevance to 1,000 years ago. And then it kind of comes down to the whole discussion of like, is the Torah there from a historical perspective, or is it there for like a constant, ever-changing learning perspective? And it's kind of interesting to think of here, because I was like, when you were talking, I was like, none of these things are relevant to this time, but it's like so interesting to think about. But then when you said too, like, a better way to do that would be sitting down with the Jewish people and like actually talking to them about what they want and what they need. And then that does happen later on. So I was like, maybe these things did exist, and like these concepts, and people felt the same way then, but I think it's different, but interesting. And I just want to thank you for this, because it was a lot to think about and a nice little pre-poem share.
Thank you. For those of you who do not know Kayla is a visiting scholar. She's studying a lot of Jewish history in a master's program where she's thinking a lot about Jewish identity. So she's definitely the right person to be talking about this with. And it's very nice to see you. I think it's like a very interesting question about the nature of Torah. I'm going to stop sharing so I can actually see. Okay. I think that it's an interesting question about like what the nature of Torah is, and like one wonders even in those discussions in the Talmud, whether it be like Esther being green, Vashti having a tail, or I don't know, Achashverosh wearing the priestly garments, whether they like actually are how the story is supposed to have been like historically understood or not, like they do become interesting discussion points for like a lot of what we're talking about. And then that's an interesting question, like how much do we read our own modern conceptions into what text is, but also like, I don't know, the Talmud was like pretty long time ago. So you're right, like they definitely did not have the language of cultural appropriation, but I feel like they understood that this like fell off. And I think that that's like really interesting, right? Because we think that it's like the age of political correctness. This feels like such a young topic. But then there's times in history where we've seen things feel hard. And then what do we do about that? What was the other point I was going to say to what you said? Oh, so that's an interesting question about the nature of Torah in general. I think that was, maybe I didn't have another point, but I think that that's like an interesting question about like the entire endeavor of like rabbinic Judaism, and how much are we reading our own approaches in. Also, like when the Talmud was written, it was also written Sasanian Persian 500 CE, and what were they reading into their own writing of the text? Like, is there such thing as like an authentic preservation, or is this about being in a chain of like continuous interpretation throughout time? That's like a great question about the nature of rabbinic Judaism altogether. And this, I think, is like an interesting test case to that issue. So thank you for highlighting it. And thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, on that note, thank you for the fruitful discussion. And see you next week. In 2 weeks from now, we will not have a session. The Maharats are all going to Rhode Island to bake matzah, which is fun.
Wow.
But that means that we will be coming back late at night. But thank you for coming. Hopefully your Parsha Tetzaveh will be slightly more interesting now after this class. And see you all next week. Have a good night.
This is a great eye-opening class. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.